On the morning of Monday, December 13th, 2004, 26-year-old Stephan Adams completed the first final of the semester at Northeastern State University in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, before driving off campus in high spirits. Less than 15 minutes later, he answered a call from his girlfriend, Brianna, during which he explained that he was heading south to the town of Weber's Falls to visit his mother. He had one little detour to take care of first. He'd offered a ride to an unidentified man and would be stopping off in Keys, a small unincorporated community along the way. Moments later, he told Brianna he loved her and said goodbye. He has never been seen again. Over the nearly 20 years which have passed, countless searches have been conducted all around the rural eastern edge of the state, in the mountainous foothills of the Ozarks, far from the flat plains Oklahoma often calls upon the imagination. Some speculated he may have had an accident, but searches of lakes and ravines have proven fruitless. Others theorized he may have fled of his own accord, but those who knew and loved him argue he had far too much going on at the time. The darkest and most compelling possibility is the one most often mentioned in whispered breaths amongst locals. It follows a complex plot, which alleges that the young, divorced father of one may have been targeted after a years-long and bitter custody battle seemed ready to turn in his favor. From rumors of an abduction and brutal assault to an unknown suspect seen near the missing man's apartment the very morning of his disappearance, his family and law enforcement believe the answers will be found somewhere beneath the vast landscape of eastern Oklahoma, hidden away with Stephan's remains. This is Trace Evidence, episode 234, The Disappearance of Stephan Adams. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine the 2004 mysterious disappearance of 26-year-old Stephan Mitchell Adams, a case overwhelmed by conflicting evidence, confusing witness testimony, accusations of perjury, and the word of one family against another. Without any further ado, this is episode 234, The Disappearance of Stephan Adams. 26-year-old Stephan Adams had a busy Monday ahead when he awoke in his Tahlequah, Oklahoma apartment on the morning of December 13th, 2004. The last few years had been a bitter and difficult time for the single father who had been in and out of court battling for visitation of his daughter following a highly acrimonious divorce. However, it appeared there was hope on the horizon and things might be preparing to turn in his favor, not just in the courtroom, but across the board. He had a custody hearing scheduled for the next week, and he was wrapping up his fall semester. He was in a rush that morning, throwing some books into his truck as he proceeded on to the campus of Northeastern State University, where he was scheduled to take his first final. He could feel the nervous anticipation that precedes big tests, but he had studied hard and felt confident in his abilities. Arriving on campus that morning, he was in good spirits and finished the test with ease, according to his professor. Just before 11 a.m., he was seen driving off campus, heading back towards the apartment he shared with his cousin. Just after 11 a.m. that morning, Stephan answered a call from his then-girlfriend, Brianna, who was eager to find out how he'd done on the test. Stephan explained that he'd crushed it and felt really good about what his score would be, but then he said something strange. While planning to drive to visit his mother, he'd picked up an unknown man and was giving him a ride to the unincorporated community of Keys. Brianna heard the unknown man's voice and, moments later, Stephan said goodbye. This was the last time anyone ever spoke to him and the first day of a horrifying nightmare which has haunted his friends, family, and the community of Tahlequah for nearly 20 years. For many, it's an enduring mystery. The story of a man who vanished in the midst of excitement and hope following a time of great upheaval. Whispers quickly emerged of strange people lingering around Stephan that last day that he was known to be alive. Reports circulated of an unknown man hanging around Stephan's truck when it was parked on campus. of a man seen creeping around his apartment building, and of another man seen pacing around the parking lot of a dollar store just across the street from his apartment building. Could one or all of these men hold some piece of the puzzle? Stephen's family certainly thinks so, as does a community that treats his disappearance and likely murder as an open secret, one where everyone knows what happened, but no one is capable of proving it. Most believe the answers lie somewhere along the rural pathways leading south from Tahlequah, in the area of Keys, or maybe even at the bottom of 10 Killer Lake. They're not alone in their belief that Stephen was the victim of foul play, as nearly a decade after his disappearance, a grand jury was convened to examine the case. It was their conclusion that not only had Stephen been killed, but they believed people involved in the crime had testified before them and perjured themselves about their involvement. So how, all these years later, have charges never been filed, nor Stephen ever located? The answer to that question all depends upon who you ask, where you search, and what you can, or in this case, cannot prove in a court of law. Stephan Mitchell Adams was born on Friday, August 4th, 1978 in Muskogee, Oklahoma, to parents Carl and Claudine. Stephen was the third son born to the couple, having older brothers Chris and Bradley. According to friends and family, Stephen was a creative, intelligent, funny, and loving child who was noted as being extremely sweet and kind. He made friends quickly and cared strongly for them, leading many to say that he had a huge heart and was the shirt off his back kind of person. According to a thorough interview on the Unfound podcast with Stephen's mother, he was a bright youngster who performed well in school, although his interests lied elsewhere. He loved being outside, whether he was swimming, fishing, playing ball, or riding his bike. He couldn't wait to get home from school so he could get his hands in the dirt and explore with his brothers, with whom he was said to be extremely close. Claudine, who goes by the nickname Deanie, went on to say that Stephen loved fishing and was so devoted to it that he often got in trouble in class for staring out the window and daydreaming about catching a big one. Reportedly, he was held behind in the second grade because of his inability to dedicate his full attention to his studies, but this would change as he grew older. Over the course of the next few years, he scored high marks in school and impressed his teachers, seemingly having found the balance between school and social life. As Stephen grew older, he began finding more passion in physical activities and sports. He started playing football and running track while committing time to the gym, where he lifted weights and began developing a strong physique. He wasn't the biggest guy on the football field, with many describing him as strong and stocky, but he put all of his effort into the game. Stephen attended Webbers Falls High School, where he quickly found himself earning attention on the field. In rural Oklahoma, high school football is a big deal, and Stephen's name was frequently listed among other high achievers in local papers following weekend games. A quick search for him through local newspaper archives throughout the 1990s results in dozens and dozens of entries praising his high performance and excellent skill on the field and at track events where he was often dominant. Powerful, passionate, and determined, there were few who could stand in Stephen's way when he decided that he wanted something. Unfortunately, while things were going well for Stephen, his home life would take a major hit when his mother and father separated, ultimately divorcing in April of 1993, just a few months before his 15th birthday. At the time, he struggled to accept the situation and went through a lot of emotional turmoil, as most children of divorce do. Despite the difficult situation, both parents did their best to ensure their children felt loved and wanted. Even though they would no longer be married, Carl and Deanie managed to maintain a friendly relationship, helping one another when needed and offering support when necessary. As fate would have it, just a few years later, Stephen would find himself on the other side of this coin. While attending Webbers Falls High, Stephen made a lot of friends through his involvement in football, track, and other competitive activities. One of these friends was a young woman by the name of Alicia Burris, who was in the same grade with him. Alicia was also involved in sports, with local papers noting her involvement on the basketball team as well as participating in track events. Few details have ever been released about Stephen and Alicia's early days, but it seems apparent they developed enough of a fondness for one another to spend time together and date, off and on. How serious the relationship was seems somewhat unclear, and while many people have given their opinions, not much that is said has made a ton of sense. It's clear that both Stephen and Alicia were seniors and graduated from Weber's Falls High in the spring of 1997, just a few months before he would turn 19. In her interview on Unfound, Deanie stated that she thought Alicia was a nice girl, though somewhat quiet, who came from a good family. She didn't think too much about the relationship, but did allege that Alicia's father wasn't thrilled with it. All of this would seemingly come to a head 2 years later in 1999 when Alicia became pregnant. Though her family were reportedly opposed to the concept, Stephen and Alicia responded to the pregnancy in the old-fashioned way. They got married because they thought that's what they were supposed to do. Whether or not they were in love, wanted to be together and have a family, seems somewhat up for debate, and through the lens of hindsight, most people don't speak positively of the coupling. Stephen and Alicia would welcome a daughter, Cheyenne, in September of 1999, and according to friends and family, while it wasn't the perfect situation, Stephen was thrilled to be a father and wanted very much to build a happy life for his new daughter. It was from her birth that he began focusing more closely on his college classes and future plans. He had been attending Haskell Indian Nations University in Kansas, where he performed well in school and continued to stand out on the football field for 2 seasons. He'd then gone on to Connors State College in Warner and picked up a job at a local hospital where he was doing well. His academic studies turned towards engineering, which Stephen had always been interested in. His goal was to obtain a degree in engineering and land a job in management so that he could provide better for himself, his wife, and his daughter. Unfortunately, just 6 months after Cheyenne's birth, in March of 2000, Alicia would file for divorce. This marks the point in which Stephen's life falls into chaos and bad blood develops on both sides. Court records show that on Friday, March 31st, Alicia officially filed for divorce. Just over 6 months later, on Monday, October 2nd, the divorce was granted, and a child custody arrangement gave Alicia full custody while Stephen had visitation rights. What exactly occurred over the course of the next 4 months is never made fully clear. But because Alicia has been silent in the media about this time in her life and about Stephen in general, we only have his family's perspective to follow. Deanie stated that she didn't think Alicia wanted to be married to Stephen and that ultimately they divorced because she had wanted to see other people. Apparently, for the first few months following the divorce, everything was fine. Stephen started spending his weekends with his daughter, but the arrangement would slowly change. Friends and family have stated that as time wore on, Stephen was spending more and more time with Cheyenne. Essentially, it's been suggested that Alicia wasn't super strict about visitation and often allowed their daughter to stay with Stephen for several days in a row and sometimes up to a week at a time. At some point, for unknown reasons, this apparent free-form arrangement gets hard edges and a great deal of animosity starts building up. According to Deanie, Alicia swung from one end of the pendulum to the other, shifting from allowing Stephen to see his daughter pretty much whenever he wanted to not allowing him to see her at all. The issue became so large that Stephen had to turn to the court to try and get them to enforce the visitation agreement in the divorce decree. On February 6, 2001, things take a sharp turn as Alicia enters an application for and is granted an order of protection against her ex-husband. There is a battle back and forth, and there are several times in which court records show that Alicia was threatened with facing contempt of court for not granting Stephen access to his daughter. This plays out in the court with a lot of motions, requests, and applications filed back and forth between the two sides well into May of 2003, when things take another sudden and dramatic turn. On Wednesday, May 14, 2003, both parties appear in court and agree to an arrangement whereby Stephen is granted supervised visits with his daughter in Tahlequah. 6 days later, on Tuesday, May 20th, criminal charges are filed against him. While exact details are not publicly available, Stephan was hit with 2 felony charges following an accusation that he had sexually abused his daughter, at this time not yet 4 years old. He was charged with lewd molestation and indecent exposure. Devastated by charges he passionately denied, Stephan would allege that he had never abused his daughter and that the accusations were used as a last-ditch effort from his ex-wife to deny him access to their daughter. Ultimately, both charges against Stephan were dismissed 5 months later in October. A preliminary hearing was set for August 29th, but when Stephan's lawyer filed an objection to what was argued to be hearsay evidence, the state requested the preliminary hearing be moved to September 30th. The state would again receive a continuance on this day, moving the date to October 16th. On the 16th, the state requested another continuance, which was granted. However, Judge Robin Adair informed the state that if they were not ready by the new court date set for October 21st, the case would be dismissed. Ultimately, that's what happens, as on the 21st, the state dropped the charges and Stephan was free to continue his custody battle. With these charges officially dismissed on the 21st, just 1 day later, on October 22nd, Alicia filed another application for an order of protection. This time, though, the judge denied her request. It's worth noting that sometime during all of this legal wrangling, Alicia remarried, and the subsequent request for an order of protection is filed under her new name, Alicia Sizemore. Now, I don't want to bog you down in all of the minutiae of court records and records of every single motion that occurred, but I do think it's necessary to get into some of the finer details, so we'll run through some important dates here. On October 23rd, 1 day after the failed order of protection, Stephan filed an application to resume visitation following the dismissal of the criminal charges. 1 month later, on November 24th, Stephan was granted supervised visitation for 2 hours per day, 3 days per week, and the judge noted this order would continue until a hearing scheduled for December 8th, or unless new criminal charges were filed. On December 8th, both parties appeared in court once again, and on that same day, another criminal charge is issued against Stephan. This time it is lewd molestation, minus the indecent exposure. 6 months later, on May 17th, 2004, this charge was dismissed. This time, though, it doesn't appear to have come as a result of the state not being ready for a preliminary hearing. Instead, the record states Stephan's lawyer filed a motion against a witness who was to provide hearsay evidence. Official court documents read, quote, "Finding declarant not competent to be witness, hearsay, testimony is not admissible, dismissed," end quote. While it's difficult to know exactly what happened here, it appears that a witness for the state did not have direct first-hand knowledge or experience with the alleged charges, and therefore their statement would be hearsay. Deeney offered some clarity on the dismissal, explaining on Unfound that a witness who had supplied a written statement to the court claiming first-hand knowledge of Stephan's alleged crime was called before the judge. When questioned, this person was unable to recall the details of her statement and answered incorrectly multiple times, leading the judge to issue an admonishment about the seriousness of perjury before noting that the witness could not testify. And it appears without this person's statement, the state had nothing more to go on. According to Deeney, a child psychiatrist assigned by the court also informed the judge that Cheyenne showed no psychological or physical signs of sexual abuse, and it was the psychiatrist's opinion that the child had been coached to lie about what had allegedly occurred. Since no official trial took place, there's no way to really get to the bottom of this, but it certainly doesn't sound good. Anyone who has witnessed two people entering into a combative divorce and child custody arrangement can attest to just how far some people are willing to go to win, for lack of a better term. I don't think we'll ever know the full truth of what the hell was going on here, and all we can say for sure is that both times Stephan faced criminal charges, those cases were dismissed without making it to a trial. 5 months later, on October 1st, 2004, both parties appeared in court once again, at which time the court ruled that Stephan was entitled to supervised visits 4 hours each weekend. This order was to stay in place until December 21st, when another hearing would be held. It was this hearing that Stephan had been eagerly anticipating, as following the dismissal of criminal charges and the previous contempt applications against Alicia for denying him access to his daughter, he was of the belief that he was, at a minimum, going to obtain unsupervised visitation rights as he had previously had, and he hoped, maybe even a better custody arrangement overall. Unfortunately, Stephan would never make it to this hearing and instead would mysteriously vanish just 8 days before it was set to take place. According to friends and family, the court battles had hurt Stephan both emotionally and financially. Paying for a criminal lawyer as well as a lawyer to handle all of the issues surrounding custody had hit his bank account hard. This was made more overwhelming as, following the initial criminal charges, he had been fired from his job at the hospital. Despite the legal battles, confronting the accusations, and fighting not just for his freedom, but for custody of his daughter, Stephan was still building his life. He began attending Northeastern State University, pursuing that engineering degree. He was sharing an apartment with his cousin, Adam Warren, at the Colonial Manor Apartments, located at 406 East Downing Street in Tahlequah, a short drive from campus. He'd picked up a new job, working at a restaurant known as El Chico's, and approximately 6 months before disappearing, he'd gotten involved in a new relationship with a woman named Brianna Farr. Money was tight, things were far from perfect, but he was pushing through and felt like the future he'd been fighting so hard for was finally within his reach. And then, in a span of just 30 minutes, he was gone. The morning of Monday, December 13th, 2004 began as any other day did for the 26-year-old father. Waking up at his East Downing Street apartment, Stephan showered, dressed, and sat down for a quick breakfast. It was an important day for him as he was scheduled to take the first of his finals, for the end of the semester had arrived quicker than he'd expected. Grabbing his books and climbing into his white GMC truck, he made the short drive over to the campus of NSU and proceeded inside for the test. Tiffany Haney, one of Stephan's cousins, would later state to the Sequoyah County Times that his professor confirmed he finished the exam at 10:45 a.m. Now, I should note, no one knows with any real certainty where Stephan went immediately after leaving campus. However, given that he had a shift at El Chico's later that afternoon and had allegedly made plans to visit his mother before work, it's believed that he returned to his apartment for a change of clothes. This is a distance of 9/10 of a mile, and according to Google Maps should have taken him no more than 5 minutes. This would put Stephan arriving at the apartment at approximately 10:50 a.m. I haven't personally seen any information statements or evidence to confirm that he went back to his place, though, so this means that he was unaccounted for approximately the next 22 minutes, from 10:45 a.m. until his then-girlfriend Brianna called him on his cell phone at 11:07. According to Brianna, she called Stephan that morning to find out how he had done on his final and to see what his plans were for the day. She'd go on to state that Stephan answered the phone and sounded like he was in good spirits, nothing to indicate that there were any problems. Reportedly, he was driving at the time and told her that he thought he had done well on the test. Asked what he was up to, he explained that he planned to visit his mother in Weber's Falls, 35 miles southwest of Tahlequah, and then he would go to work afterwards. However, before he could do any of that, he needed to stop in Keys, a small unincorporated community 11 miles south from Tahlequah along Oklahoma 82, the same route he would have used to travel to Weber's Falls. Brianna later explained, quote, "He told me he was in Keys. I asked him why he was in Keys. He said he had to take some guy home. At one point, I could hear what sounded like the muffled voice of a man in the background." End quote. Brianna was never told who the man was, nor how Stephan had ended up being the one to give him a ride. According to friends and family, he wasn't the type to offer a ride to a stranger, and even if he were, he wasn't in a great position to do so that day. Reportedly, he didn't have any money on him and was extremely low on gas, making it somewhat odd that he'd be willing to drive out of his way that afternoon. Brianna went on to say that the call ended normally after a few minutes, with Stephan telling her that he loved her and saying goodbye. She had no reason to be worried or concerned and assumed that she would speak to him later, but this would end up being the last time anyone ever spoke to Stephan Adams. 23 minutes later, at approximately 11:30 a.m., Adam, the cousin that Stephen shared his apartment with, tried to call him. The phone rang once and then went to voicemail, suggesting that someone, perhaps Stephen, perhaps someone else, had physical possession of the phone and hung up on the call. From this point forward, that phone would never ring again, with all calls going directly to voicemail, leading investigators to believe that it was powered off or destroyed sometime after this 11:30 attempted call. For the next few hours, life continued on as normal for Stephen's friends and family, as no one was aware that he'd already veered off from his plans for that day and was missing. When Stephen failed to show up for his shift at El Chico's, this caught the attention of management, as he was normally a highly reliable employee who always called if he was going to be late and never missed a full shift without contacting them first. They attempted to reach Stephen on his cell phone, but only got his voicemail. Whether or not anyone at the restaurant called his apartment at that time has never been reported. It's interesting to note that had Stephen followed the plans he'd mentioned to Brianna, he would have dropped the unknown man off in Keys and then continued on south to Weber's Falls. After visiting his mother, he was set to go to El Chico's in Muskogee for a shift beginning at either 2 or 2:30 p.m. The drive from Weber's Falls to Muskogee is approximately 32 minutes long. Looking over the timeline, if Stephen was in the area of Keys at 11:07, he should have arrived to his mother's home just before 12 p.m. He then would have been able to visit with his mother for an hour to an hour and a half before leaving at approximately 1:30 to arrive in Muskogee right around 2 p.m. Stephen never arrived at his mother's, nor El Chico's, which means something went wrong along the way to Keys, or perhaps from Keys to Weber's Falls. It wasn't until later in the evening of that Monday night that calls started getting made between different people who were all trying to locate Stephen. Brianna reached out to his mother, Deanie, at approximately 10 p.m., asking whether or not he was there. When Deanie explained that she hadn't seen her son all day, Brianna became concerned and told her that she hadn't heard from him since before noon. In response, Deanie got in contact with Adam, and he confirmed that not only hadn't he been able to get in touch with Stephen all day, his previous attempts to reach him had gone straight to voicemail. Now, with everyone growing more concerned, friends and family decided to take what information they had and head out to search for him. They began by patrolling along Route 82, heading south of Tahlequah towards the area of Keys, wondering if maybe he'd run into some kind of trouble with his truck. Perhaps he had run out of gas, or worse yet, had crashed and ended up in a location where he had no service on his phone, as much of the rural area south of Tahlequah was a cell phone dead zone at the time. After reaching Keys, 82 continues south, following along the western shore of Lake Tenkiller, a massive lake and reservoir formed by the damming of the Illinois River, covering nearly 13,000 acres. This was an area Stephen was highly familiar with, as his love of fishing often brought him to Tenkiller. Wondering if he had perhaps changed his mind and decided to ditch his previous plans in favor of a quiet fishing outing, the search shifted west to South Indian Road, which runs parallel to 82 but along the eastern shore of Tenkiller. Unfortunately, no signs of Stephen nor his truck were found there either. When Stephen couldn't be located nor contacted, his family decided to report him missing to the police. At the time, nothing major was done to try and track him down. A BOLO was issued for both Stephen and his white GMC truck. Feeling that police weren't taking the report seriously, friends and family continued their own searches for the missing 26-year-old. It would later be reported by friends and family that it took them days to convince the police to get moving on this case, losing those vital early hours. Tragically, on Tuesday, December 14th, the day after Stephen vanished, his mother suffered a stroke while out searching for him with cousin Tiffany Haney. She was quickly rushed to the hospital and would be transferred to St. Francis Hospital in Tulsa, where it was reported that she had a severe brain bleed and had paralyzed the left side of her body. Stephen's father, Carl, was also heavily involved in initial searches for his son, later stating that he felt abandoned and dismissed by local law enforcement. As the next few days agonizingly ticked by, friends and family grew more and more concerned. By the end of the week, their optimism was falling away, replaced instead with a growing doubt that Stephen would be found safe or alive. He didn't show up at his job for the rest of the week. He didn't attend school to take the rest of his finals. His cell phone wasn't used, and his bank account remained untouched. For those who loved him, it seemed quite obvious that he had been the victim of some kind of foul play. Their attention turned towards the unknown man he'd given a ride to the day of his disappearance, but with little to go on, it was difficult to try and identify that individual. On Saturday, December 19th, 6 days after Stephen was last seen, it was announced that the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation was joining the search for the 26-year-old. Over the weekend, the OSBI oversaw several air searches looking for Stephen or his truck along Route 82, around Keys, and in the area of Lake Tenkiller. In hopes of stirring up more interest and tips, they announced a $1,000 reward for information leading to his recovery. Around the same time this was happening, Carl reached out for additional assistance from outside of law enforcement, hiring Dick Fry, a private investigator with the Buenaventura Agency out of Oklahoma City. Almost as soon as he began digging into the case, Fry was under the impression that Stephen had been the victim of foul play, noting in his mind that it would be a hell of a coincidence that this guy just randomly went missing in the midst of a bitter custody battle just 7 days before a hearing in which he was expected to regain partial custody. When that court date on Monday the 21st came and went, everyone who knew Stephen now realized the gravity of the situation, with his father saying, quote, "He wouldn't have missed that for nothing," end quote. Unfortunately, the year of 2004 would come to a bitter end for Stephen's family. Deanie was still in the hospital and in bad condition, being in a medically induced coma. Carl was working with the Dick Fry Agency to try and find his son, but tips and leads were few and far between, and while they attended court in Stephen's place in hopes of maintaining some connection with Cheyenne, what limited time they were granted with her would be short-lived. As the calendar flipped over to 2005, hopes were very low, but in January, some old-school boots-on-the-ground investigation would lead to the first of several new developments about the man believed to have hitched a ride with Stephen the day he went missing. Investigator Fry managed to track down several witnesses who had seen two unknown men lingering in areas important to Stephen the Monday he vanished. One man was seen in the parking lot of his apartment complex, seemingly hanging around without a purpose, as though he were keeping an eye out for someone. Witness statements placed the stranger in the parking lot during the time that Stephen was known to be at school, taking his final. Whether or not he was still there when Stephen returned home afterward could not be confirmed, nor did anyone see Stephen speaking with or near the unknown man at any point in time. Another suspicious man was reported to have been hanging around a Dollar General store, less than 400 feet northeast from Stephen's apartment. The parking lot is laid out in such a manner that Stephen's building runs east to west along the southern border of the parking lot. Another group of apartments runs north to south along the western edge, while the Dollar General runs north to south along the northeastern edge. Essentially, the Dollar General and the apartment complex share the same parking lot. This led many to theorize that the man seen at Dollar General was the same man seen lingering near the apartment, and while that may be the case, witness descriptions varied to enough of a degree that it's never been positively confirmed if there were one or two people creeping around the area that day. For the sake of sanity, I'm going to discuss them as if they were two separate people for now. Unlike the apartment guy, the Dollar General stranger was not only seen by multiple witnesses, but several people ended up speaking directly to him. According to investigators, this unknown man pulled into a parking lot across from the Dollar General in a charcoal or faded black colored 2000 Ford Ranger pickup truck with a chrome toolbox in the bed. He arrived at approximately 7:50 a.m. and oscillated between sitting in his truck, staring straight ahead, and pacing around in the parking lot in front of the store for hours. At some point in time, an employee asked the man what he was doing, to which he replied that he was a construction worker working at a site in Keys and he was waiting for a ride. Why exactly he waited around this parking lot for hours to catch a ride to Keys 12 miles south of the dollar store, when he had his own truck parked across the street, has never made sense to anyone looking at this case. The man is reported to have been gone from the area at approximately 11 a.m., 7 minutes before Stephen told his girlfriend that he was giving a man a ride to Keys. OSBI forensic artist Harvey Pratt sat down with witnesses in order to construct a composite drawing of this man, which is circulated in local papers. The man was described as a white male, approximately 40 to 50 years of age, standing 5 feet 11 inches tall and weighing between 160 and 200 pounds. He had brown, salt and pepper, collar-length hair and several days' growth of a salt and pepper beard. He was seen wearing a tan Carhartt brand jacket, faded blue or black jeans, a flannel shirt, a dark green stocking cap, and eyeglasses. A link to this composite will be provided in the show notes. The OSBI would note upon release of the sketch that this man is wanted for questioning, and while they don't have enough evidence to call him a suspect, he is certainly a person of interest. Dick Fry believes the Dollar General guy is a major figure in the case, and is likely the man Stephen offered a ride to. He had a tight schedule that day, had no money, and was low on gas, and so it's highly likely that while he may not have normally been the type to offer a ride, if he were offered some money in exchange for gas, he might have accepted, especially since Keys was along his way south to Weber's Falls. Fry went on to state that they were able to access Stephen's cell phone records and found it last pinged off a tower south of Tahlequah, which would match heading both towards Keys and Weber's Falls. Over the course of the next few months, the OSBI and Dick Fry continued working on their ends of the investigation, although they shared what information they could in hopes of finding a solution. In July of 2005, 7 months after Stephen was last seen, Fry stated that they had received reports of an alleged sighting of him taking place between 11:30 and noon the day of his disappearance. A clerk at a convenience store in the town of Cookson reported that Stephen arrived alone in his truck and parked near an outside ice machine. He supposedly entered the store and walked around for around 5 minutes or so, appearing nervous, according to the clerk. He purchased a drink, and it said that he drove off between 11:45 and noon. The clerk specifically noted that he was by himself and they did not see anyone else in his truck. Cookson is another small community and is located just 8 miles south of Keys, 2 miles east of Lake Tenkiller. This sighting, though, has become a hot-button topic and a major source of controversy in this case. Allegedly, the clerk working at the store who claims to have seen Stephen was a member of his ex-wife's family, and there are some who believe this sighting is little more than a lie designed to throw investigators off the trail. Others think it is little more than an odd coincidence and that he went missing sometime after leaving this store. Curiously, one person who might be able to greatly assist police is the man Stephen gave a ride to that day, but he has never been found, nor has he ever come forward to share what he knows. Had Stephen disappeared after dropping him off in Keys, you can't help but wonder why this guy wouldn't be willing to come forward and tell what he knows. Fry went on to note that he believes Stephen may have been victimized by someone he knew, and that there may have been another person in the truck with him that day, outside of the unknown man. Fry suggested an unknown woman could have been present. He noted that his firm believed that Stephen was murdered, and the OSBI Public Information Director Jessica Brown stated that their agency agreed with that conclusion, saying that they also believe Stephen is dead and was the victim of a homicide. Carl Adams agreed with both, noting that he'd assumed his son had been killed within 2 weeks of his disappearance. At the time, he swore he would never stop looking for his son no matter what, noting that the family had been receiving threatening calls telling them to stop investigating lest someone else might get hurt. December 13th, 2005 marked a full year since Stephen had last been seen, and while tips and information were still coming through to investigators, nothing major had yet been discovered. Dick Fry would tell the Sequoia County Times that over the previous months, he had received numerous tips from people who claimed to have seen Stephen's truck in and around the Keys area the day he vanished. Fry noted that their search had expanded into neighboring states, and that they had conducted multiple foot searches, as well as sending divers into several lakes and bodies of water in the area. Tips continued to come in, the investigation moved forward, and yet, for the most part, Stephen's case began to fade from the headlines. News stories took prominence, fresher horrors captured the attention of the community, and while one family spent their every waking moment trying to find their missing son and brother, others turned to more recent incidents. Days would turn to weeks, weeks to months, and months to years. Then, in July of 2011, some 6.5 years after Stephen vanished, his father decided that if law enforcement wasn't going to do something about his son's murder, then he was going to have to force their hand. On Friday, July 1st, Mark Collier, a Tulsa-based lawyer hired by Carl Adams, went before Judge Darrell Shepard, who signed an order allowing a petition to be circulated for signatures. This petition calls for a grand jury to convene to examine the mysterious circumstances surrounding Stephen's disappearance and also alleges that prosecutorial and investigative agencies refused to allow the Adams family to see any files, evidence, or statements gathered during the nearly 7-year investigation. In addition to calling on a grand jury, the petition sought to remove the local DA's office from serving as legal advisors to the grand jury based on what Adams argued is a conflict of interest. It also stated that the current and former members of the DA's office might be called as witnesses before the grand jury, and the inquiry may require an investigation into the DA's office itself. Sequoyah County DA Brian Keister noted that the law allows for a private citizen to call a grand jury and have witnesses testify under oath. In reply to the petition, he informed the media that Mike Nance, a retired Tulsa homicide detective, had recently been hired by the DA's office to work cold cases. However, he pointed out, the primary investigation lie with state authorities. He explained, quote, "This investigation is still ongoing. It has been turned over to the OSBI, and they are the primary investigators. Our office works closely with them, but is primarily involved with the prosecution. At no point has an arrest been made in this case, nor has information been submitted to the DA's office that would lead to an arrest." End quote. After obtaining all of the necessary signatures, the official petition for the grand jury was accepted. Interestingly, the petition contained multiple pieces of information which had previously been concealed from the public. Here are some of the more revealing and eyebrow-raising statements made in this petition. Sections D and E read, quote, "On information and belief that the individual that Mr. Adams provided a ride in his truck was Ronnie Meachling, who has told people that he was delivering Mr. Adams and his truck to other individuals. Mr. Meachling has sent a threatening letter to his girlfriend from jail telling her to keep her mouth shut about Mr. Adams. Rick Ensminger has told several individuals that he saw Mr. Adams beat to death and that Ronnie Meachling was involved." End quote. Just these two statements alone hold a hell of a lot more new information and represent the first time any persons are directly named as possibly being involved in this crime. This, however, is not the end of the new details. The petition goes on to mention Vicki Lyons, a detective with the OSBI who was assigned to the case. Section G reads, quote, "Detective Lyons has potential information about the disposition or location of Mr. Adams' truck and the names of individuals who may have been present when Mr. Adams was murdered." End quote. This is interesting because, to this date, Stephen's truck has never been recovered. So to find out there are persons who may possess that knowledge and may have been present during the murder certainly seems to confirm this was a homicide involving multiple people. The question being, was this a random crime, or did someone perhaps put them up to it? That question is broached with sections I and J, which read as follows, quote, "Some of the possible suspects in the disappearance and possible murder of Mr. Adams may have had connections to Mr. Adams' ex-wife, Alicia Adams Sizemore. Alicia Adams Sizemore failed a polygraph examination concerning her involvement in Mr. Adams' disappearance and possible murder." End quote. So now you've got the accusations being tied down to some kind of a strong base. It doesn't take a lot of maneuvering to determine that Carl Adams, through this petition, is suggesting that Stephen's ex-wife may know people involved in the crime. And while I'm not a strong proponent of polygraph examinations, I do think it's interesting that she agreed to take one in this case at all. Failing that exam doesn't do much for me in terms of linking her directly to any guilt, but for a case that seems to revolve strongly around this bitter custody dispute, it's a little difficult to ignore all of the circumstantial evidence that seems to be piling up here. In its final sections, the petition essentially notes that both the Wagoner and Cherokee County District Attorney's offices need to be barred from acting as legal advisors to the grand jury. The petition notes that, despite a large amount of alleged evidence and the names of specific figures being involved, they have refused to share their files with the family and have never made a move towards filing charges against anyone. It is the belief of the petitioner that the DA's office position is in direct contradiction to those of the family, thus creating a conflict of interest. In addition, it's noted that members of each DA's office could be called before the grand jury, broadening that conflict. The testimony given could result in a necessary investigation into each office, which Adams again notes creates an untenable situation between Stephen's family, the grand jury, and the involvement of the two DA's offices. So, there's a lot going on here. To try and break it down in layman's terms to the best of my ability, it sounds like Carl Adams and family are arguing that there is strong evidence out there against specific individuals, that at least one of these people may have admitted to being present during Stephen's murder, while the other allegedly stated that he'd been involved in ensuring Stephen and his truck arrived at a certain location to a certain group of people. It's further alleged that these people may have connections to Stephen's ex-wife, who apparently failed a polygraph when asked about it. Despite this, as well as other information in the possession of the OSBI, Dick Fry, and Carl Adams, the DA's office has refused to share any of their information, nor have they agreed to take any actions against any of the named parties. The purpose of the grand jury was to impanel a group who could guide a deeper investigation and bring about certain determinations in relation to whether or not charges should be filed, and if so, against who. On Monday, September 12th, grand jury selection began in Cherokee County. Multiple subpoenas were issued, and those summoned included Stephen's parents, private investigator Dick Fry, his ex-wife Alicia Adams Sizemore, a group of people who allegedly last saw Stephen alive, and multiple law enforcement officers, including the lead investigator from the OSBI. The grand jury convened and extended over the course of the next few months, ultimately coming to its conclusion in January of 2012. After 4 months, minus an extended break for the holidays, the grand jury issued their final report and recommendations on January 12th. The report issued was heavy and damning, not just of certain individuals who had testified before the grand jury, but also towards law enforcement for their severe lack of action. The 12 jurors in the report noted their belief that Stephen had been the victim of a homicide, that his body is likely somewhere in eastern Oklahoma, and that his truck was seen after he disappeared on Monday the 13th. In addition, of the 50 different witnesses called before them, the jury noted their belief that multiple witnesses had perjured themselves during their testimony and possessed a motive to have Stephen killed. The jurors went on to express their surprise over certain witnesses, writing they were, quote, appalled by the numerous witnesses that have testified before the grand jury who have extensive criminal histories, end quote. I should note, some witnesses called had committed up to 20 different felonies for which they had not been charged nor punished, a scathing indictment of the DA's office in general. While not a massive acknowledgement, there was a small but curious detail of the crime raised by the grand jury as well. Apparently, after Stephen went missing, someone showed up at Northeastern State University and sold some of his textbooks back to the bookstore. Textbooks that are believed to have been in his truck the day he disappeared. An excerpt from the grand jury report about this reads, quote, based on the investigation of this grand jury, we, as a majority, believe that Stephan Adams' white GMC pickup truck was located parked, locked, and abandoned by the Illinois River shortly after Stephen disappeared. We believe that the contents of Stephen's truck were stolen, including Stephen's NSU textbooks. We believe that a person sold those books back to NSU and received compensation for said books." End quote. Expounding on this topic, investigator Vicki Lyons noted that they had information confirming the truck was located within 24 hours of Stephen's disappearance. However, it sounds as though it's possible that the truck was found by a group unrelated to the initial crime and that they may have stolen items from the truck, including the textbooks. Vicki Lyons explained, quote, "We do know that Stephen's truck was found abandoned following that day. It was found in Cherokee County, and the people who found the truck stole the contents of the truck, but the truck itself has never been recovered." End quote. Unfortunately, with this being a grand jury, the full transcripts and witness testimonies aren't released to the public, so we can't know by what method the jury came to the conclusion that his truck was found by the Illinois River and that the items from it were stolen. If the books were returned, which seems to be confirmed, that would suggest someone found the truck or obtained those textbooks by some method following Stephen's disappearance. It's worth noting that Lake 10 killer, which has been searched multiple times, results from the damming of the Illinois River. The report goes on to lay out the grand jury's conclusions as well as their recommendations to the district attorney's office, specifically DA Brian Keister. The statement reads, quote, "Based on the investigation of this grand jury, we as a majority believe that Stephan Adams is deceased and was the victim of homicide and that his body is located somewhere in eastern Oklahoma. Based on the past investigation and investigation conducted and ordered by the grand jury, we as a majority believe that certain individuals had motive to murder Stephan Adams. However, despite our tireless efforts, we have not discovered who caused Stephan Adams' death or the location of his body. The majority of the grand jury believes that it is likely that the individual or individuals responsible for murdering Stephan Adams did appear before the grand jury and expect that ultimately the killers will be brought to justice. The grand jury believes that some of the witnesses that testified before the grand jury did testify falsely and recommend that the office of Brian Keister, district attorney, pursue criminal charges against those individuals who clearly have lied while testifying under oath. We do believe that the grand jury's efforts have been successful in discovering additional evidence related to the disappearance of Stephan Adams. We expect that the information received through the grand jury process will be used to help find the body of Stephan Adams and ultimately will lead to the arrest of the individual or individuals involved in his disappearance." End quote. In response to all of this, DA Brian Keister noted that they would go through all of the grand jury documents and see what actions could be taken. Of course, had any actions been taken, I probably wouldn't be doing this episode right now. So, despite all of this extensive work and a 4-month investigation where the grand jury were able to direct investigators, no charges have ever been filed, and the search for Stephan, his truck, and those believed to have killed him continues. More than a year later, in December of 2013, the OSBI increased their reward for information to $5,000, noting that, quote, "persons of interest have been developed, but more information is needed to make arrests," end quote. In this announcement, they stated that the OSBI, Tahlequah Police, Cherokee County DA's office, and Cherokee County Sheriff's Office had followed hundreds of leads, but still did not have everything they needed to move forward. 4 months later, in March of 2014, a tip received by investigators led them to a rural field to search for potential human remains. The 2-acre field, located south of Park Hill in the area of Horseshoe Bend Road, was noted as being just north of the unincorporated community of Keys. This tip corroborated previously obtained information which led investigators to conduct a search of the field utilizing ground-penetrating radar. On Thursday, March 13th, the person operating the radar equipment noted an anomaly 2 to 4 feet beneath the earth that appeared similar to human remains. A 10 by 10 foot area was marked off for excavation while police continued searching through the remainder of the field. A second spot was later located and also marked off as a backhoe was set to be brought in the following day. According to the Daily Oklahoman, a specialized backhoe was brought in, during which time it was utilized to shave down the soil inches at a time until such a depth had been reached that hand tools were utilized. Archaeologists employed by the state's medical examiner's office were directed to both locations and additional digging was conducted. In the end, however, it was determined that there was no trace of human remains in either location. DA Brian Keister noted that the search hadn't been a complete loss, saying, quote, "We did excavate both sites that the sonar indicated might have provided some evidence, but we didn't find anything. It's back to the drawing board. But we did get a couple of leads out of it as well that came out of it in the last couple of days." End quote. Mike Moore, Violent Crime and Drug Task Force Director for District 27, was also present at the dig. He noted that the person who previously owned the field that was searched might have had something to do with Stephen's disappearance, though he noted this person had died 3 years earlier. Moore was disappointed by the failure to find any traces of Stephen, saying that they had hoped to be able to bring him home to his family for a proper burial, something the Adamses are desperate to see happen. He explained to the Sequoyah County Times, saying, quote, "There has been a theory for some time that there might be a body located on this property. The most important thing is to bring Stephan Adams home. The number 2 goal is to solve the crime." End quote. A little over 10 days later, on Monday, March 24th, police from multiple jurisdictions arrived at a new search location, described as being just east of the Fort Gibson Historic Site, approximately 23 miles west of Keys and just northeast of Muskogee. DA Keister was very tight-lipped about the tip which had led them to the new location, saying only that it came in during the media flurry surrounding the previous search. The tip directed them to a hidden brick cistern, an underground structure meant to collect rainwater. Searchers cut down multiple trees that were in the way, allowing for a backhoe to dig through the earth. Workers needed to construct a ramp to allow the machinery to reach the bottom of the cistern. Eventually, getting down deep enough, they moved to hand tools and were sending up buckets of dirt and sediment that had flooded into the cistern over the previous years. Despite their efforts, they would emerge empty-handed, having searched through the entire cistern with no signs or traces of Stephen. Following the failure of these searches to produce any major results, the case would once again grow quiet. 7 years later, in February of 2021, Sequoyah County District Attorney Jack Thorpe sat down for an interview about the case and what developments, if any, had occurred over the previous 7 years. Thorpe was direct, stating that it was his belief that Stephen was the victim of a homicide and he was seeking new leads to assist. Thorpe discussed how, while Stephen is technically a missing person, investigators have uncovered enough to determine that he is deceased. Thorpe noted that most missing persons cases don't have a lot of information, but that this case is different. But it's a matter of being able to link what they know directly to evidence, namely Stephen's body. According to Thorpe, they have persons of interest but need more to move on it, and he believes there are definitely people out there who know the truth. He went on to state, quote, "There are a lot of folks in Cherokee County and Muskogee who know exactly what happened. They need to contact the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, the DA tip lines, the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office. We just need that one break. I'm sure the bad guys in the Adams case are somewhere in our 4-county district. We are never going to stop looking." End quote. Asked about his belief that Stephen was killed, Thorpe stated that there had been no activity on his credit cards, bank account, or social security number since the day he vanished. All of Stephen's clothing was left behind in his dresser, all of his money in the bank. In addition, Thorpe stated that Stephen suffered from severe asthma and required an inhaler. He was in possession of 2 at the time of his disappearance, and both were found at his apartment. In addition to Stephen, his truck is also still missing and has been the subject of multiple searches as recently as 2 months ago, in October of 2023. Chris Adams, Stephen's brother, was present for a dive search of Dirty Creek, described as a large stream in Muskogee County less than 4 miles south of Weber's Falls. Chris was joined by members of the DA's office while the search was conducted by Arkansas Missing Come Home, Chaos divers from Illinois, 2 volunteer divers from Washington and Georgia, and the organization Revamp, Remember Every Victim and Missing Person. Divers launched their boats from Gore Landing at 11:30 a.m. on Wednesday, October 18th. The early part of the search hit several roadblocks as low water levels and debris slowed them down. However, not long after getting into the creek, they located a vehicle beneath the murky waters. A piece of the vehicle was brought up to the surface for analysis, while an additional 4 vehicles were spotted beneath the water. After obtaining identifying data from these vehicles, Eric Helms of the DA's office was able to run them through the system. Unfortunately, none of them belonged to Stephen. Patty Rush, who works for Revamp, discussed the finds with local media, saying, quote, "None of them belong to Stephan Adams, but we have one more place to look. We will continue to look at every possible opportunity. This is what we do. If we don't find their vehicle, we can at least rule out, and that's good too." End quote. Chris was disappointed by the results, but described it as a step in the process, one which has been going on for nearly 20 years. Another failed search, another hit to their hopes and goals, but still the search continues. From the DA's office to the family themselves, no one is ready to give up, and all of them believe that through their perseverance and stubbornness, they will eventually find the truck, Stephen, or the evidence necessary to charge someone with his murder. Asked about the man Stephen gave a ride to that afternoon, the OSBI noted that despite multiple tips received over the years alleging to know the man's identity, they have never managed to track him down. Carl Adams continues to try and find his missing son, believing that there are people close by who know exactly what happened to him. Discussing the case, he brought up Stephen's former in-laws, noting that Bob Burris, Alicia's father, had allegedly threatened to kill Stephen on more than one occasion, including an outburst in court when the charges were dropped against him during the child abuse proceedings. Carl toes the line, saying, quote, "I've got a real strong feelings about the motives, and better not comment on that. I've accepted a long time back he's dead. A hit type thing." End quote. Indeed, it appears that the answers to this case linger in several different places, namely the minds of those who were involved in the plot to abduct and kill Stephen, concealing his remains and vehicle somewhere that, nearly 20 years later, not a single trace of them has been found. Somewhere in eastern Oklahoma, between 3 or 4 different counties, several bodies of water, and a lot of difficult and empty terrain, the truth remains just out of reach, waiting to be discovered. Unfortunately, as time winds forward, persons of interest pass away, memories fade, and the search grows bleak for one family desperate to bring Stephen home and see justice done in his name. When last seen, Stephan Mitchell Adams was described as being a Native American male with collar-length brown hair and brown eyes. At the time of his disappearance, he was known to sport a beard. Stephen stands 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed approximately 185 pounds. He suffers from severe asthma and requires the use of an inhaler. He was last known to be wearing jeans and a black t-shirt, as well as carrying a dark-colored book bag. Missing along with Stephen is his truck, a 1995 GMC Sierra short-wide pickup, white in color. The vehicle has the Oklahoma license plate number SCQ-714. This truck was last seen leaving the campus of NSU the morning of Monday, December 13th, 2004, and may have been seen in and around the area of Keys between 11 and 12 p.m. that same day, and possibly outside of a convenience store in Cookson around the same time. Stephen's case remains active, and investigators report they continue to receive tips and information, with the most recent search having been conducted just 2 months ago. Stephan Mitchell Adams was just 26 years old when he went missing while driving south from Tahlequah, Oklahoma, towards Keys, where he was alleged to be dropping off an unknown man to whom he'd offered a ride. He had no cash on him and was low on gas. He planned to continue south to Weber's Falls to visit his mother before proceeding on to his job in Muskogee. He never arrived in Weber's Falls and has never been seen again. His absence has left a gaping hole in his family for parents who have lost their son, brothers who are now 2 instead of 3, and somewhere in the murky chaos of all of this, a little girl who grew up being told not that her father loved her or wanted to be there for her, but that he purposefully abandoned her. A resolution to this case doesn't just bring home a missing son, brother, and father. It sets the record straight on nearly 20 years of lies, manipulation, and deception, all designed to transform Stephan Adams from dedicated father missing under suspicious circumstances to a heartless monster who abandoned everyone he cared for. How far are you willing to go to protect the lives of murderers? That's a question anyone with information on this case needs to answer for themselves. The search is far from over, however. Asked about the case, DA Jack Thorpe replied, quote, "This has gone on long enough. As long as my heart beats, I will not stop looking for Stephan or stop trying to solve this case. I know Stephan was murdered and his body was hidden. Somebody out there knows the truth. Somebody needs to point law enforcement in the right direction. Stephan needs to be found, and the wrongful parties need to be brought to justice." The disappearance of Stephan Adams is one of those cases where it feels like it should have been solved by now. Most missing persons cases don't have a lot of information, evidence, persons of interest, or suspects. They're mysteries from the first step. You know where the person was, where they might have been going, and possibly what their plans were, but little else. For the average missing person, there isn't a complicated plot, there aren't a group of people with a solid motive, and there aren't witnesses reporting strange details in the hours and minutes leading up to that disappearance. It's like they have simply fallen off the face of the earth, and so, frustrating as it may be, it isn't difficult to understand why your average case remains unsolved for so long. How can you know what you're looking for when every stone you kick over fails to point in any particular direction? I've covered so many cases like that it's infuriating, but Stephan's case is different. As D.A. Thorpe said, there is a lot of information and evidence in this case, and I say that with only what is out there publicly. The information contained within the grand jury testimonies is apparently much more in-depth and more focused than anything law enforcement or the family have shared. That being said, there's only a few theories which have ever really been shared by law enforcement or speculated about in general. But before we jump into those theories, there's a couple of details about this case I want to make note of and clarify first. We'll begin with Stephan's name. If you find yourself interested enough in this case to do some digging, one of the first things you're going to come across is 3 different spellings are used for Stephan's name. I've seen it spelled Steven, Stephen, and Stephan. Why exactly there are these variations, I can't say for sure. According to Deanie, her son's name is spelled Steven. Public records, school yearbooks, and newspaper articles prior to his disappearance confirm that is the legal spelling of his name. But later articles specify that it's Stephan. And I even saw some newspapers issuing corrections, saying, sorry, we spelled it Stephan and it should have been Stephen. Again, the wrong spelling. What's even more disconcerting is that his name is spelled in each of these 3 variations on official court documents. Strangely, NamUs lists his legal name as being spelled Stephan, so your guess is as good as mine. But I did want to address this because I am sure there are already emails heading my way about how I spelled his name in the title of this episode. Next, there's Stephan's truck. Depending on where you look, you'll get one of 3 different descriptions. In some places, it's a 1995 white GMC Sierra. In others, it's a 98 white GMC Sierra, and in others still, it's a 1998 white Chevy. I honestly don't know why there's all this confusion. When I ran his license plate through the system, it kicked back that he drove a 1995 white GMC Sierra short bed truck. Namus, while spelling his name wrong, also specifies that this is the correct vehicle. I'm not sure where the other descriptions come from, as I couldn't track down their origin. I can say that the original grand jury petition got the vehicle wrong, calling it a 93 GMC pickup. However, law enforcement has access to the DMV and should have been able to clear this up years ago. I was able to verify the vehicle, and I don't have access to half of the software that they do. So again, another piece of important information in this case, which is all over the place in the media and on and off official missing person sites, that is debated or just blatantly wrong. Thirdly, and sticking with the truck, I admit a lot of confusion about statements made by law enforcement about it. First, it was never located, and it's believed that whoever killed Stephan had stolen items from the truck, including his textbook, which was sold back to the school. Then, his truck was located, approximately 24 hours after he went missing. A group, apparently unrelated to those who had plotted to kill him, found the truck parked along the banks of the Illinois River and stole the items from it, selling the books back. Then, the OSBI pretty much says they know it was seen in the area of Keys in the hours after Stephan's disappearance, but they don't specify where it was or who saw it. Then law enforcement simultaneously uses the Cookson convenience store sighting as a key point in the case, but also notes that Stephan went missing before this alleged sighting, and they don't know what to make of it. You know, after going through all these details, maybe I do understand a bit of why this case remains unsolved. Fourth, and finally, I wanted to address the allegations made against Stephan prior to his disappearance. We have two separate occasions upon which Stephan is accused of crimes and arrested. The first time, he's charged with lewd molestation and indecent exposure. This case is dismissed 8 months later after the state continually asked for continuances and were never ready to present the case against him. In all actuality, court records state that rather than these first charges being dismissed, the state dropped the charges across the board. The second time, Stephan is charged with lewd molestation, and these charges are dismissed 6 months later when a key witness on the case is ruled incapable of testifying, while another witness is alleged to have written a statement about the crime, but when called to testify before the judge, could not recall the details of the statement they had supplied. It's hard to say with any certainty what happened here. Since Alicia's side of the family has never spoken publicly about it, all we can do is look at the court records and see what Stephan's family said about the charges. Deanie claimed that, the second time around, the witness who had written the statement was directly admonished on the stand about the severity of perjury. A psychiatrist, assigned by the court, also reportedly testified that Cheyenne showed no physical or psychological signs of sexual assault, and it was her belief that the child had been coached to lie about what may or may not have happened. Again, I don't know the truth of what happened here. I only know how it played out in court, and that resulted in charges being dropped or dismissed both times. Stephan was never found guilty, and neither of these incidents actually made it as far as going to trial, with both of them being shut down before or during preliminary hearings. I wanted to clarify about this because one of the motives, in fact, the primary motive in this case, could be majorly impacted by these court proceedings. You have to ask yourself, could someone have wanted Stephan out of their lives so badly that they'd accuse him of sexually assaulting his own daughter, knowing it was untrue? As terrible as that may be, it would hardly be the first time something like that has happened. But then you also have to ask, if they truly believed this had happened, if the accusations were made not out of malice, but out of a full belief that the crimes had occurred, how far might someone be willing to go if they felt the legal system had failed them and left their child or grandchild open to further abuse? It's a horrible situation for everyone involved, but for some, it may also be what they consider a justification for murder. So now, let's turn our attention towards the case and see what does or doesn't fit, what makes the most sense, and just what in the hell might have happened here. Leading up to his disappearance, Stephan is involved in numerous legal battles with his ex-wife from the time she files for divorce in March of 2000. Depending on who you ask, Alicia seeks the divorce either because she never wanted to be married in the first place and only did so because she was pregnant, or maybe she had an interest in someone else and wants to pursue that relationship. Either way, she files for divorce. They haven't been married super long, so they don't have a ton of assets between them, and outside of their daughter, it's pretty easy to separate things out. Initially, Alicia is granted custody while Stephen is given visitation, and everything goes along smoothly. For several months, the two switch off, with Alicia giving primary care and Stephen seeing his daughter on weekends. According to his family, things are going so well that Stephen's actually seeing his daughter more often than not. Weekend visits are extended into 4 and 5 days at a time, with Alicia allegedly happy to allow Cheyenne to spend more and more time with her father. This all changes at the beginning of 2001 for unknown reasons. This leads to court battles where Stephen claims he's not being allowed to see his daughter, and based on court records, Alicia is warned to live up to the terms of the custody agreement or face contempt of court. Now, some have argued that maybe the reason she wasn't allowing him to see the daughter was because of the assault allegations that would come later, but if that were true, you would think they would have been filed sooner. In February of 2001, Alicia obtains a protective order against Stephen, and over the course of the next 2 years, the battle for custody continues in court, with orders being given, contempt applications being filed, and it's obviously a real mess. It's such a disaster that both Stephen and Alicia's lawyers withdraw at different points, and new lawyers have to be hired on. So then we arrive in May of 2003 when Stephen is hit with the first set of charges. When those charges are dismissed or dropped 5 months later in October, Alicia applies for a new protective order the next day, but this time her request is denied. 2 months later, after a hearing in which the court deems that Stephen has a right to see his daughter, in fact, that very same day, a charge of lewd molestation is filed again. That charge is dismissed 5 months later in May of 2004. From May through December, it's a series of back and forth motions. Stephen's lawyer files motions to enforce visitation. Alicia's lawyers file motions to restrict visitation. In October, the court finds Stephen is entitled to visitation, and the order is issued, with the next hearing scheduled for December 21st. But as we all know, he disappears 8 days earlier on December 13th. For many, that means his disappearance had to be connected to the custody case playing out, but for others, it's all a big coincidence and nothing more. On the morning of Monday, December 13th, Stephen makes the 5-minute drive from his East Downing Street apartment to the NSU campus, where he's set to take his first final. According to his professor and other witnesses, Stephen completes the test and is seen leaving campus at approximately 10:45 a.m. It's assumed that he returned to his apartment to change clothes and drop stuff off, but no one has ever really been able to confirm that. His then-girlfriend, Brianna, calls him at 11:07 a.m., and they chat on the phone for several minutes. He explains that he did well on his final and is going to visit his mother in Weber's Falls before heading off to work in Muskogee. Surprisingly, he states that he has to stop off in Keys first as he's giving someone a ride. Brianna hears this unknown man's voice in the background, but never finds out who he is or why Stephen was giving him a ride in the first place. A few moments later, Stephen tells Brianna he loves her and that he'll talk to her later. This is the last time anyone ever speaks to Stephen outside of those who may have been responsible for his disappearance and probable murder. From here, we've got two theories to address together. Some people believe that Stephen may have never arrived at his mother's, not because he was the victim of a crime, but because he had an accident or somehow veered off the road, landing in a deep ravine or perhaps, and more likely, a body of water, such as Lake Tenkiller. Now, had Stephen dropped off his passenger in Keys and continued on his way, he'd likely have stuck to either Route 82, which heads south along the eastern shore of the lake, or maybe he would have headed west to Indian Road, which runs parallel to 82 on the western shore of the lake, although this would have been really out of his way. Both of these roads would be extensively patrolled and searched by family and law enforcement after his disappearance, and no signs of Stephen or his truck were found. Being in the foothills, this is a somewhat curvy route that cuts through a lot of wooded areas with large gaps between towns and businesses. Hell, Keys itself is an unincorporated community, and of its most recent census showed less than 1,000 residents. Now, Stephan had had some run-ins with traffic police throughout his life, as records show he'd accrued several speeding tickets. Even during her interview on Unfound, his mother said he was known to drive very fast, and that a trip that might take your average person 20 minutes would take him 10. So, when you look at the potential route, it isn't difficult to imagine Stephan could certainly have been speeding and lost control of his truck, tumbling down off the road. The problem is, no signs of an accident are ever located. The idea of him crashing into a ravine has pretty much been ruled out by the fact that he's never been found. Locals report that many of these areas are popular for fishing, hiking, and hunting, and it's highly unlikely that over the course of nearly 20 years, no one would have stumbled upon at least the truck if it were flipped over in a ravine or canyon somewhere. When it comes to bodies of water, however, that raises a whole different series of possibilities. There's Lake Tenkiller, a massive reservoir covering nearly 13,000 acres. This lake has been searched multiple times in the past, and while several different vehicles have been found beneath the surface, none of them contained human remains, nor were any of them positively identified as belonging to Stephan. Looking around the area, there are a lot of different bodies of water that could have played a role, from the Dirty Creek south of Weber's Falls to the Arkansas River, Weber's Falls Lake. Suffice it to say, this is not an area that lacks rivers, lakes, ponds, and streams. So, could Stephan have crashed into the water, been knocked unconscious, and drowned, sinking to the bottom along with his truck? I don't think that's something that can be dismissed out of hand. There have been far too many missing persons cases where decades later, the person was found still strapped into their car in a pond or a lake 10 minutes away from where they were last seen. Even though divers have gone into Lake Tenkiller, it doesn't mean they were in the right area, and with it being as large as it is, there's a hell of a lot of other possibilities. Curiously, if you believe the alleged sighting of Stephan in Cookson after he was seen in Keys, that would place him less than 2 miles east of Tenkiller. Now, were he actually seen in Cookson, then it's unlikely he would have been on South Indian Road, since that's on the other side. That should help narrow down search areas, but to date, no trace of Stephan or his truck has been found in that area. While it's entirely possible Stephan went off the road and crashed, possibly into water, I don't rank it high on my list of likelihoods in this case. Don't get me wrong, it could have happened that way, and while terrible and tragic, that would be a far better outcome than the other alternatives, but I think it's all the information we have about other possibilities that make this less likely. I'd also like to take a moment to touch upon the suicide theory, which I've seen talked about on a ton of forums and websites. Obviously, you can never know what's going on in someone else's mind, and anything is possible, but there doesn't appear to be any evidence pointing in that direction. Stephan's life was finally improving. He dealt with the accusations against him, picked up a new job, was involved in a committed relationship for at least 6 months, was wrapping up his semester at school, and it was finally looking like things might be turning his way in the courtroom. He was extremely eager to attend court the next week to try and get his visitation expanded, or perhaps even to go for full custody. Everyone who spoke to him in the days leading up to his disappearance noted that he was in good spirits, looking forward to the future, and was making plans. All of that may be circumstantial, but it seems extremely unlikely that in the middle of a plan to take his own life, that he'd pick up a hitchhiker and give him a ride while telling his girlfriend that he was heading to his mother's and then to work. Not to mention, what exactly could he have done that would result in neither him nor his truck being located all these years later? I guess you could argue he just drove into a lake or river, and while possible, it doesn't exactly seem probable here. That leaves us with the final theory, the one his family believes, the one law enforcement believes, and the one locals talk about as though it's already predetermined fact, that Stephan was the victim of foul play. There are 2 branching angles to the foul play theory, one being that he was specifically targeted for abduction and murder by people he knew, or that this may have been a completely random crime. Rather than back and forth the details of those theories, we'll take a look at what we know and just see what fits in and makes the most sense. On the morning of the 13th, multiple witnesses report unknown men lingering around several different areas pertinent to Stephan. Dick Fry, the private investigator, says that he found witnesses who said a man was hanging around the NSU parking lot near Stephan's truck. Then there are the 2 men seen in the area of the Dollar General and Stephan's apartment parking lot. which is essentially shared with the Dollar General. Reports state a man is seen parking his truck across the street from the Dollar General around 7:50 a.m. and then spends the next 3 hours bouncing between sitting in his truck and wandering around the parking lot. Asked what he's doing, he reportedly tells a witness that he's a construction worker awaiting a ride to the unincorporated community of Keys. Obviously, you might be asking, if he has his own truck, why the hell does he need a ride? Unfortunately, your guess is as good as mine, but most people assume it's just a ruse to get inside Stephen's truck. Now, Stephen's mother said he wasn't the type to just give rides to strangers, and he wasn't in the habit of picking up hitchhikers. Many locals I've seen discussing this case have noted that it wasn't uncommon at the time in that area for people to pick up hitchhikers or to offer rides. That being the case, some have argued that Stephen may have done the same thing, but I kind of have an issue with that. The Dollar General guy is noted as being gone at 11 a.m. 7 minutes later, Stephen speaks to Brianna and tells her that he's giving a man a ride to Keys. Assuming this is the same guy, if people in the area are in the habit of giving rides, why does it take him more than 3 hours before Stephen is the first person to offer him one? It sounds like he should have been given an offer way before that. So sure, maybe no one stopped by the Dollar General that day until Stephen, which I guess is a possibility. But you have to ask, if you're a construction worker and you're needing to get down to Keys for a job, and you've got your own truck that for some reason you're not driving, what good does it do to get down there after 11 in the morning? He's been hanging around for over 3 hours. I feel like if you can't make it to your construction job earlier than that, you're unlikely to keep that construction job. I've often wondered if investigators looked into any construction projects in the Keys area around that day and if they managed to find anything, but there's no way to know for sure. Now, in the evidence section, I discussed how witnesses also saw a man hanging around Stephen's apartment parking lot that day, and that man has often been considered a separate person from the Dollar General guy because descriptions vary somewhat. I can't say so with any certainty, but I'd be willing to go out on a limb and say these are probably the same person. It seems exceedingly unlikely that these two guys are pacing around, lingering around essentially the same parking lot within 100 to 200 feet of one another without someone seeing them simultaneously. The door to Stephen's apartment, which faced south, is less than 400 feet from that Dollar General. To this day, the man Stephen gave a ride to has never been identified, nor has he come forward to speak with investigators. It's somewhat difficult to believe that he doesn't possess some knowledge about this case, or maybe he has something to hide. Otherwise, why not reach out and try to clear yourself? Assuming he just caught a ride and that's it, this really shouldn't be that complicated. Now, you can argue he's afraid he'll be railroaded or he's afraid to get involved, which is possible, but you can't even send in an anonymous tip sometime over the span of nearly 2 decades? I find that difficult to swallow. From here, everything is extremely speculative. The most information provided about what might have happened comes out of the grand jury petition. We get 2 names mentioned, Ronnie Meachling, who allegedly tells others that he was hired to deliver Stephen and his truck to other individuals, and Rick Ensminger, who claims that he was present when Stephen was beaten to death. Ensminger goes on to say that Ronnie Meachling was present and involved with the murder. Allegedly, Meachling, while in prison, writes a letter to either his girlfriend or Stephen's girlfriend, at which point he threatens the recipient to keep quiet and not to talk about the case. Now, Rick Ensminger I can track. I've looked into him, and for the most part, he hasn't had a lot of major issues with the law. The vast majority of his record is traffic-related. DUIs, driving without a license, and a charge I imagine is real specific to this area, driving in a stream bed. There is one violent crime on his sheet, assault and battery with a deadly weapon from 2007, but strangely, even the court records don't show any solid disposition. Based upon the way the papers go, it sounds like Ensminger had to pay a fine and that there was some issue with that payment, but it doesn't look like prison time was given out. Beyond that, I can't find any solid connections between Ensminger, Stephen, his former in-laws, and this case. However, if indeed the grand jury petition is accurate and he claimed to have been present when Stephen was beaten, It's hard to understand why no charges would be filed unless there's zero corroborating evidence. Turning our attention towards this Ronnie Meachling, this guy's some kind of a ghost. I can't find a single record acknowledging that he even exists. Now, this might be the result of a misspelling, or maybe his name is intentionally concealed under a pseudonym, although in court record I'd expect that name to be John Doe and not a made-up name. I exhausted every resource I have, and I could find nothing on this guy. I started digging into different spellings and found someone with the last name Meckling, which could be him, but I have no way to confirm that. The only place the name Ronnie Meachling ever appears in print from what I can find is in the grand jury petition and newspaper articles written about it. That's it. So if you've got some information on this case and can provide me with some intelligence about this so-called Ronnie Meachling, I'd love to hear from you. It's been alleged that this Meachling might be the man Stephen gave a ride to that fateful morning. What information they have to lead them to this outside of statements made by Ensminger and statements allegedly made by this so-called Ronnie Meachling remains unknown. I can say it's interesting to note that while Meachling is a ghost, I was able to connect Ensminger with properties located in Fort Gibson, not far from where at least one major search was conducted. Unfortunately, none of that really supplies any helpful information or insight into this case. At the end of the day, these are two names mentioned in the grand jury summons, but it's worth pointing out that more than 50 people testified, and while the grand jury was clear that they believed people had lied to them, they don't specify who. So, finally, all attention turns towards Stephen's ex-wife and her family. Almost since the day he went missing, there have been rumors that this family was involved in his case and possessed additional information about both his and his truck's whereabouts. No solid evidence has ever been supplied to support these allegations, though, unless something concrete was put before the grand jury, though in that case, it would be really difficult to understand why no charges have ever been filed. Most people point towards the most obvious factors here: the custody dispute, the court battle, and the sexual assault allegations. There's several different ways to look at it, as I touched on earlier. There's the possibility that the allegations were made up and designed to get rid of Stephen, and when that failed, more serious steps needed to be taken. There's also the option that the allegations were legitimate, and after the court system failed to hold him accountable, a decision was made to handle it outside of the purview of the court system. Either way, people point their finger towards Stephen's former wife and in-laws primarily, I believe, because it's hard to imagine that this bitter, fiery court battle didn't somehow play a role in this crime. When you factor in that he disappeared a week before the next hearing, where it seemed like things might finally turn his way in regard to custody, it becomes even more difficult to ignore. That doesn't condemn them, that doesn't mean that they're guilty, but for a lot of folks, that's the way it is. People in the area who were around when this happened say it like it's a fact. Oh yeah, he was killed over a custody battle. I think when you lay out everything that is known about the case, it certainly seems to point in that direction. From the alleged failings of polygraphs to the refusal to discuss any of this publicly, to Deanie herself saying that neither Alicia nor her parents ever once reached out to express interest, concern, or to console her about this disappearance. Deanie went so far as to theorize that they didn't show any concern because they had already known what happened. I can't prove that. The district attorney's office can't prove that, but this is certainly the direction I'd be focusing my primary attention on. A lot has been made of Alicia's father, allegedly shouting, "I'll kill him," in the court after the charges were dismissed, and while I understand that, I don't think you can take someone's reaction in the heat of that moment as an indication of their possible guilt in a crime like this. At the same time, it certainly doesn't look good when the person you're shouting about killing goes missing not long after. Private investigator Dick Fry stated his belief that approximately 4 people were involved in this crime. 1, who catches a ride with Stephen that day. 2 others are the place he is guided to or possibly forced to drive to, who execute the crime. There's even a suggestion from Fry that one of the 4 may have been a woman, and that she may have been in the truck that day when he gave the unknown man a ride. I can't really say where that comes from, as I haven't heard anything about a woman being involved through any other sources, but he's the private investigator, and we know he's got more information than he has shared publicly. In the end, you kind of find yourself in the same place as the family and law enforcement. It seems so obvious, assuming that the most popular theory is the correct one, but there's no corroborating evidence. There are stories people have told, but can't prove. There are locations people have mentioned, but nothing's been found. There are polygraphs allegedly failed, but no further action is taken. This isn't a case of looking for a needle in a haystack. It's more like looking for a needle in a stack of needles. Every previous search has been preceded by a tip that sent law enforcement to a location they had already been considering. From the one near Fort Gibson, to the Dirty Creek, to Lake Tenkiller, to the field south of Park Hill. And if you look hard enough, you can connect different people from this story to each of those locations. From uncles to cousins, from Spencer to James, there's almost always someone associated with this case living in or close to one of the primary search locations. Hell, investigators even said that their search in Fort Gibson was conducted on property formerly owned by a person of interest. So, what do you believe happened here? Did Stephan have a horrible accident that somehow led to him remaining undiscovered for the last 19 years? Did he come upon a stranger and fall victim to a random act of violence? Or was he specifically targeted by those who had a strong motive to want him gone, either because they wanted him out of their lives or perhaps because they believed he had committed a hideous and disturbing assault against his own daughter? One thing is for certain, there are people in the area who know the truth. Somewhere across the counties of Cherokee, Muskogee, Sequoia, and Wagoner, Stephan's remains are likely concealed. For how long must his family suffer, unable to bring him home and provide him with a proper burial? All it would take is one phone call, one email, one anonymous tip to help them confront their grief, the pain of a loss they have not yet fully defined because there are no answers. Unfortunately, unless Stephan is found, new evidence is uncovered, or someone finally comes forward, the disappearance of Stephan Mitchell Adams will remain open, unsolved, and maybe not so cold yet. If you're looking for more information about the disappearance of Stephan Adams, there are many news sites and podcasts which have covered his case. Unfound did a long and thorough interview with Stephan's mother that I certainly recommend checking out. For this episode, I found the Sequoia County Times, Tulsa World, and the Daily Oklahoman to be the most helpful. If you have any information about the disappearance of Stephan Adams, please contact the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, Northeast Investigative Regional Office at 918-582-9075. His case number is CR04180. You can also contact the Cherokee Nation Marshal Service at 918-207-3800. Finally, you can submit information directly to me at either traceevidencepod@gmail.com or through my secure and encrypted email at tetips@proton.me. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at traceevpod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. At this time, I'd like to take a moment to thank some of our amazing Patreon producers: Andrew Guarino, Ann Bertram, Camelia Tyler, Christine Greco, Danny Renee, Denise Dingsdale, Desiree Lauro, Donna Buttram, Deani Dyson, Guillerme Pinto, Jennifer Winkler, Justin Snyder, Kara Moreland, KY, Kelly Michelle, Lars Jensen Fengel, Leslie B., Lisa Hobson, Madison Lahoulier, Melissa Breckeisen, Nick Mohar Schurz, Stacy Finnegan, Stephanie Joyner, and Tom Radford. I can't begin to express just how much all of your support means to me, as without all of you, Trace Evidence would not be possible. If you're interested in learning more about this case or other cases featured on the show, please visit trace-evidence.com. There you can find case breakdowns, all social media links, merchandise shops, case descriptions, media, and options for donating, including PayPal and Patreon, should you wish to support the show. That concludes our coverage of the disappearance of Stephan Adams for now. I want to thank you all for listening, and I'd like to apologize for my erratic schedule this past month. I ran into a series of personal and technical issues that severely interfered with my ability to get this episode out. That being said, I plan to release one more episode this year, next week, before taking a holiday break and then coming back full strength to weekly episodes beginning again in January. So thank you all again for listening and for your patience, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.